Hey guys, ooh, spooky background here. How's it going? Welcome to Chapter 7. This is a kind of cool, interesting chapter. You heard me saying when I was going through the last chapter that it was a little tricky that some of the things that we were talking about in Chapter 6 actually happened after Chapter 7. I find that a little annoying now sometimes when I teach the history of psychology, but that's because Chapter 6 was on perception, and really people have studied perception all the way through the history of psychology. This chapter has a place in history. It is a representation of a time, and it's very interesting. History started in the pre-1900s with Wundt, etc. We've talked a little bit about that, but it comes to this point in the early 1900s, between say 1915 and 1945, 1950, and then it goes into the 60s as well. That's when this kind of psychology became really popular and really dominant. And in order to understand why, you have to understand the times. And I'm going to introduce you to something that, if you've never heard of it before, it's something called eugenics. If you've never heard of it before, it will kind of blow your mind. So let's do that. I'm starting here. This is a timeline of sort of the history of genetics, as it were, starting early on from Darwin, even a little bit before Darwin. They've got some things here that they think is relevant. But if we imagine Darwin did his thing around 1860, okay, and then Mendel, not long after, figures out the actual mechanism. So let's talk this through a little bit, just so we have a sense. What Darwin really noticed is he first of all was aware of something called artificial selection. Racehorse breeders have been doing this for decades, if not centuries. Dog breeders as well. When Darwin saw these breeding operations, what they showed is if you bred two fast horses, then their offspring tended to be very fast. Okay, and if you bred slow horses, their offspring tended to be slow. If you bred black dogs together, the pups that came from that union tended to be darker on average. And in fact, you could even breed for things like temperament. You could breed dogs that were kind of up and active, like a border collie, looking at sheep and chasing it around. You could breed much more relaxed kind of dogs, like a lab, for example, which generally has a very soft, gentle mouth, which is good for retrieving ducks. And so people who were breeding animals knew for a long, long time that if you wished to have an animal that had certain traits, you could essentially create that animal by forcibly breeding to older animals that had the traits you wanted. And so we knew that traits were handed down. And Darwin knew that traits were handed down. And really Darwin's contribution was to say, okay, you know what I'm seeing over there in the artificial selection world? Well, what if there's sort of a natural variant of that? Not somebody that puts together the mother and father, but what if the mother and father find each other because they're looking for attributes associated with success? Okay, and so that's sort of Darwin's angle on it that really changed everybody's way of thinking. But Darwin still didn't know the way it happened. He did not understand how information was inherited. That's where Mendel came in, where Mendel really got to genetics proper and started going at the mechanism, and then it just of course takes off from there. And there's all sorts of stuff, and I don't expect you to know any of this stuff. Here's a big one, by the way: Watson and Crick sort of figuring out the structure of DNA. Okay, what I want you to understand about this was really exciting to science, right? We start with and let's talk about the context, the problem they were trying to solve, because it's going to be relevant to this chapter as well. The problem that Darwin was wrestling with was this: how did life come to be so complex? Why are there so many different life forms? Life takes so many different shapes, so many different sizes, consists of so many different behaviors. How did this complexity of life come to be? That was the question. And Darwin was imagining, well, maybe it started by very simple life forms, but through natural selection, these life forms differentiated over time and grew to be this whole world of life forms that we see. Why do I mention that to you? A question of this chapter is going to be the following. When we look at adult humans, their behavior is extremely complex, shows all this complexity in their behavior, and yet they started out as children with a very simple set of behaviors. How do we go from that simple set of behaviors to this complex, rich set of behaviors? Back to Darwin, how do we go from a very simple life form to this complex variability of life forms? Back to behaviorism, how do we go from very simple behavior to this complex, rich set of behaviors? Okay, so it's sort of the same process that we're trying to kind of get at, but you're going to see this tension between the sort of genetics and the learning theorists as we go. So that's what I'm trying to set up for you. We'll get there. All right. So what a point I want to make in this genetics world is this was really, really exciting for science. Darwin, of course, kind of put the world on its ear when he came out with his Origin of the Species book. It changed everything in every science. Everybody changed the way they think about things. And then when Mendel comes along and actually identifies how this happens, science was like, woo, and suddenly genetics was everywhere. Okay, it was a major sort of breakthrough for science to understand how heritability occurs, and everybody was kind of caught up in that buzz. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. In fact, when we look at the era that we're in, it's sort of here, or at least it starts here. It goes a little further. It goes to about here. But this is going to be the era of time we're going to talk about in this learning chapter. And, really where it all begins is going to be right around here, somewhere between 1902 and, well, into the 1950s. I should have stretched it. What the heck? Let me just get it right here now. Let's just get this right. There we go. Why not? No need not to edit on the fly. There we are. We are sort of in this era of time. So these are going to be psychologists working at a time when genetics and nature was all the rage. In fact, I'm going to call this the era of nature. So I want to give you a sense of that rage, of how nature focused everybody was, and the extreme to which they took it. And I think when you have an understanding there, you'll understand why people like Watson and others reacted so negatively to this era. Okay, so what was this era? Well, here's the thing you may not know of, something called eugenics. I went through my whole undergraduate and I never heard of this. And it blew me away when I heard of it. It was almost like one of these conspiracy theory things. Like, are you sure this really happened? Why do we not all know this? It really happened. So what is eugenics? It's a simple idea. It's an idea that lives on. It's a very dangerous idea. And let me give you the idea. You know how we talked about artificial selection? If you wanted to produce a dog that has certain attributes, all you have to do are breed the right dogs. Well, once people really understood how this process worked, they said, do we want our species, human beings, to be the best representation of our species that we can be? Do we want to be the smartest, strongest, most attractive, etc. version of ourselves? Well, you know what? We can do that. We know how to do it now. All we have to do is control who breeds with who. And if we, for example, prevent people with low intelligence maybe from breeding, this becomes the question, right? What become the characteristics that you decide to select on? But the general idea is maybe there's certain human beings who we just should not allow to breed. We should only allow the good ones. What's good? I don't know. But we should only allow the good ones to breed. And if we did that, if we prevented people maybe with certain diseases or certain, mental states or certain whatever, anything we label suboptimal, if we prevent them from breeding, then their genes will be removed from the human gene pool. And all that will be left will be these beautiful good genes. and we will have made our species better. And we could do this relatively quickly across the space of a few generations, maybe, depending on how well we can make this all happen. Are you scared yet? Does this sound familiar? The part that really scared me was this. Science embraced this for many, many years. The first International Eugenics Conference in 1912. There were quite a few eugenics conferences, and these were not like fringe kind of weird things. These were people really interested in genetics and applying what we learned from Darwin and Mendel to the human species. And so they were wrestling with issues like, well, what are the preferred traits of a human? What are the, if we think of this future of the human species, what are the traits that species should have? And they also talked about things like, well, how do we prevent certain people from breeding? Like, is it the case that we're going to sterilize people somehow? Or, what are we going to do? What are good humanistic ways, nice ways to prevent somebody from having children? And so imagine a bunch of intellectuals getting together regularly to discuss ideas like this in a, geeky academic way. That's what was going on. And at the same time, here's the perfect baby girl is a triumph for eugenics. And so they're showing that, hey, look, if we find a really great mother and a really great father with all these great attributes and they breed, look at the beautiful babies they produce. And so this started to gain traction. There started to be the idea that this was a good thing to do, to create our better species, to the point where you started to see protest. Sterilization of mothers violates UN Charter Act, Section 1 and 2. There you go, right? This was the news of the day, and people were starting to get worried because there was serious discussion about identifying people who shouldn't be breeding and doing things like sterilizing them. This was science leading this. And here's the scary thing. I mean, the logic is accurate. And all it takes is somebody else to be sort of, to pick it up and run with it. Somebody did pick it up and run with it here, by the way. This took a while. You've seen some of the timelines. 1912, we were getting into 1930s. And then when we get into 1940s, this is still kind of floating around. And, this guy, he liked it quite well. He picked up this notion, and he said, well, hey, all you pussyfooting around scientists with your whatever, you're right. This is a really cool thing to do, but trust me, I know what the right attributes are, and I know how to prevent people from having children if I don't want them to. The right attributes are those characteristic of the Aryan race: blonde hair, blue eyes, tall, strong. That's what we want the future of humanity to look like. And how do we get it that way? Well, we start identifying groups that we consider suboptimal. Let's say anybody who doesn't have what Hitler would consider a normal sexual orientation. Of course, Jewish people were a target for Hitler, and virtually anybody could become a target for Hitler. He could suddenly declare that your group, whatever that was, that the human species would be better off without you. And, he didn't worry about sterilization. He just decided to round people up and put them in concentration camps and kill them at levels never done before. And so this is, I think, the point where a lot of scientists, and scientists can be a little blind every now and then, this is when a lot of scientists went, oh, crap. This is a scary idea, this eugenics idea. Okay, now, all of this is sort of happening. When did Pavlov start doing his thing? 1910s, 1920s. Pavlov was kind of, starting to do his thing there. And then not long after that, John B. Watson, who really is sensitive to everything I told you about, came about and started doing his thing. And what I want you to realize is their things were, in a sense, the revenge of nurture. they, again, living in this era where everyone's thinking, oh, we're everything. By the way, they thought at that time there was a lot of research on intelligence being genetic, and there is a genetic component to intelligence. So they're saying, whoa, the genetic people, the nature people, everything's nature. Everything's heredity. And these people were like, no, everything is not nature. What happens in life matters. The experiences we have mold us and change us and make us the people we are. It's not just the genetics we are born with that determines who we are. And so they were on almost a mission, especially John Watson and those who came after. Pavlov, I don't know if he was so much on a mission as others. I'll tell you the story of Pavlov in my next lecture. But those that came after were really trying to show that it's not all about nature, that nurture matters, that learning matters, that the experiences in the environment matter. And that's why they became so strongly connected to this, because they wanted to show that in a very strong and scientific way to kind of counter the science of nature that had been started by Darwin and others. So this really is a battle of nature versus nurture. And this chapter is all about nurture, flexing its muscles, so to speak. Okay, so I think it's very important you understand that historical concept as we jump into this. I'm going to give you another quick lecture about Pavlov to kind of set the stage on Pavlov a little bit, and then I'll be popping in and out throughout. All right, talk to you later. Bye-bye.